Welcome to CNI Jerusalem Calling, your source for unfiltered U.S. Mideast policy news. I'm Frederick Butler, CNI Communications Director. Today, our featured host will be CNI board member Alison Weir. She is the Executive Director of If Americans Knew, a think tank dedicated to providing facts and analysis on Israel-Palestine to the American public. She is the former journalist who has traveled independently throughout the hot spots of Gaza and the West Bank. She writes and speaks widely on Israel-Palestine. Her writings have appeared in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, Counterpunch, The Link, various other publications, both in the U.S. and abroad, and a number of anthologies on the issue. Ms. Weir, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm honored today that I'll have as our guest Senator James Abourezk joining us from South Dakota. Mr. Abourezk was first a congressman and then a senator from South Dakota to the United States Congress, beginning in 1971 through 1979. Mr. Abourezk's parents were Christians from Lebanon. The senator himself was born in South Dakota and has lived there most of his life, but he was the first Arab American to serve in the United Senate. Mr. Abourezk first served in the United States Navy during the Korean War. He received a degree in civil engineering from the South Dakota School of Mines in Rapid City, and then a law degree from the University of South Dakota School of Law in 1966. He was elected as a Democrat to the House of Representatives and served from 1971 to 1973. He then was elected to the U.S. Senate, where he served until 1979. As a senator, Mr. Abourezk took part in a number of notable activities. He was known for criticizing a U.S. agency that was linked to the CIA and that provided training to foreign police forces. He was also the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Indian Affairs and has been very active on that issue. With his fellow senator from Oregon, Mark Hatfield, he introduced an amendment that was trying to allow for more direct democracy, an initiative that failed but that had wide support among many people around the country. In 1974, Time magazine named Senator Abourezk one of the 200 faces of the future. Are you there on the phone?
Yes, I am.
As I speak around the country, and I'm sure that you experience this as well, I am astonished to still find, well, not surprised given the state of the U.S. media, but how few people around the United States really seem to be aware of the power of the Israel lobby in Washington, D.C., in largely determining our policies, especially having to do with the Middle East and with Israel-Palestine in particular, and how often so little of that is covered in the U.S. media. So today I'd like to speak with you about that aspect of this issue quite a bit, since you've had so much firsthand experience with the lobby in your years in Congress. I'm looking at the excellent book that you wrote. It's called Advise and Dissent, Memoirs of South Dakota and the U.S. Senate, that was published a number of years ago, and also the excellent book by Paul Findley, also in the United States Congress from Illinois, his book, They Dare to Speak Out, which was published several years ago and then reissued not too long ago. These tell quite a bit of your experiences in Congress that I hope we'll have a chance to discuss today. Maybe we should start with when you first started to serve in Congress early in the 1970s. I have some inscriptions here. I'll read a little bit, and then maybe you could tell us more of the background about some of these experiences. For example, right at the beginning, when you had just been elected from South Dakota, you had accepted an invitation to speak at Yeshiva University in New York, but apparently there were quite a few student protests about that. Do you recall that?
I do. I was invited, and I accepted the speaking invitation. And before I had a chance to go up there, I had a visit from a Rabbi Miller who came down from, I assume, from Yeshiva, telling me that the students were protesting my invitation and that I could ease things off a great deal, ease the protest, if I would just make a simple statement. I said, what's that? He said, would you say publicly that you're in favor of face-to-face negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis? I'm in favor of face-to-face. But at that time, that was a campaign issue by the Zionist lobby. They said they wouldn't be able to negotiate unless it was face-to-face with the PLO, and I don't know why the PLO wouldn't do it at that time, but I said, well, no, listen, that's an issue that's brought up by Golda Meir. I said, I'm not going to sit there and take sides in this thing that way. He said, well, it's really unfortunate because they're going to protest heavily. They're going to have signs and turn out in riots when you come up there. I said, well, would you like me to withdraw my acceptance of that? And he said, yes, that would be better. So I did. I had an interesting comment from a friend of mine who, in fact, happened to be Jewish. After that, he said, well, they're for face-to-face negotiations over there, but not here in the United States.
Here you're talking about an incident that occurred getting close to 30 years ago.
More than 30, it's 38 years ago.
Then a little while afterwards, I think you were invited to be a principal speaker at a rally that was, in that case, going to be in Rochester, New York. This was to raise money for victims of the Lebanese Civil War. And as I'm reading here in Paul Finley's book, the rally's organizing committee was immediately showered with telephone bomb threats because you were going to be speaking.
I don't remember that, but that's very likely.
It says here that there were 23 calls warning that the building would be blown up if, quote, Abourezk appeared on the program.
I don't really remember that, but I tell you, I must have excited somebody.
Then a little bit later, this is in December of 1973, you had given a speech at the National Press Club in Washington. Covering that speech is a journalist that's well known today, Wolf Blitzer.
Oh, yeah, that, by the way, that was January of 74 in what they called the Federal Press Club. I remember that one. That was an alternative press club from the National Press Club, and it was for blacks and women who apparently couldn't get into the National Press Club.
What I have here, and can you correct me and expand on this, was that Wolf Blitzer at that time was working for AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
Yes, he was a writer. He was a writer for them.
He wrote for their publication called the Near East Report.
Yes. Which
was really a publication for the Israel lobby itself.
Yeah, that's what it was. Yes, exactly what it was. I had made a tour in the late fall of 1973 of the Middle East. I hit every country over there, and I talked to every leader of every Arab country, including the PLO, but not including Iraq. They wouldn't meet with me. So I met with people in Egypt, probably some other countries in North Africa, but the Saudis, the Emirates, everybody, Syria, Lebanon, every single one of them told me that they would happily sign a peace agreement with Israel. Israel would withdraw to the 1967 borders, to behind those borders. I was repeating that in that press conference. I was telling everybody what I had been told. This little guy, Wolf Blitzer, got up and asked 2 or 3 hostile questions, and he left. And the next day, the Near East Report had a report from him, headlined, Abourezk sells out to the Arabs. That was kind of my first initiation with the lobby. Wolf Blitzer, I don't think his worst sin is being a Zionist. His worst sin is being boring. I don't know if you ever watched him on CNN, but he puts me to sleep. He's probably the worst newscaster I've ever seen in my life. Then on top of that, he's a Zionist.
What I'm reading also about that particular incident is that his report was sent out to Jewish Americans who had contributed to your campaign.
Yes.
And then caused considerable damage. Senator Abourezk, we were talking about Wolf Blitzer's work as a reporter for the Israel lobby a number of years ago, I believe in about 1975 approximately, I think it was. 1974. He had written about your speech at a National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Now, what did this do to your fundraising? His report was mailed out to people that had contributed to your campaign.
Well, he did. It didn't hurt my fundraising because I wasn't raising money anymore to run. I wasn't going to run again. I had made up my mind early I'd just take one term and get out. The newsletter was sent to me by a friend of mine in New York, Carol Bernstein, who's a Jewish woman, who supported me and sent that and said she was ashamed to see that this kind of thing was being done. That's when I first learned about what they had written about me.
Well, I understand that while you were a senator, you held hearings looking into the legality of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. I think those hearings were in 1977. Is that correct?
I don't remember the year, but I do remember having hearings on it, yes, in the Judiciary Committee.
It appears that you held those important hearings, and yet that none of your colleagues attended.
Not a one. No, I was there by myself. That happens a lot, though, in the Senate. What I used to do when I had a hearing, I would have my press secretary set up television lights and a TV camera in the room. No film, of course, no videotape. Other senator staff people would see what was happening and bring their senators down right away. That was the only way you get more than one member there to the hearings. That didn't work with that one, though.
Can you speculate about why no one wanted to be seen or be around those hearings?
The Israeli lobby has got every senator and every congressman pegged, and that is if Congress people do something the lobby doesn't like, they'll put them on the negative list so they can't raise money anymore from members of the Israeli lobby. So that's understandable. It scares people to death.
So is that what you feel was going on about a week or so ago with the Goldstone report?
Yeah, the resolution in the House that passed overwhelmingly. Although I have to say there were a few members that surprised me by not signing on to it, by voting against it. And a couple, three from California I thought was interesting. I think they're losing support just in dribbles, not in mass movement. Losing support because I think people are beginning to see how bad it is over there. And especially the Goldstone report I think was very important. The Israeli lobby book by Mearsheimer and Walt, those two professors, had a great impact on people. Then the Goldstone report, and if you saw Goldstone on Bill Moyer's show, I saw him. He was a very respectable, very fair person, very sound person. And to have him denounced like that, I think was a disgrace, a real tragedy. I'm sure that no member of Congress ever read that report that I would know of. Just simply they were following the lead of the Israeli lobby, which they do periodically. They go out and get letters signed, resolutions signed, and get them to vote for those resolutions just to make their enemies look bad.
I saw that there was an enemies list that came out at some point. I think you were one of the key names on that list.
Well, I wouldn't be surprised.
The very first one.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
There's one other thing that I think is very revealing, and it's something that Mr. Abourezk wrote in his own book, and I've seen it elsewhere as well. This took place in about 1977 with a headline story in the Washington Post by the very famous investigative reporter, as he's considered, Bob Woodward, writing about the amount of CIA money that had gone to Jordan. I think it was around $10 million. As you pointed out, during the same period, over $70 million, 7 times as much money, had gone to Israel, and yet none of that was mentioned in the Washington Post report. Do you remember? Can you tell us something about that?
Oh, I sure can. Yeah, I remember that very well. There was a gigantic headlines for several days in the Washington Post on the front page about King Hussein of Jordan receiving all this CIA money. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal the second day, that Israel had received a lot of money from the CIA at the same time. So I called the State Department and asked for Hal Saunders, who was the CIA liaison, I guess, with Congress. Hal came and brought with him a CIA agent to my office. And I said, what about this report? They both told me that Israel had received about 7 times the amount of money during that same period of time from the CIA. And so then I called Bob Woodward at the Post. And I said, were you aware that at the time you wrote this story that Israel was receiving much more money? He said, yes, I knew. He said, I understand how you feel about the Middle East, Senator, but it didn't seem to me that was something the readers would be interested in. And I said, well, don't you think that should be up to the readers? Well, he wasn't going to move, so we hung up with each other. But I thought that was a disgrace.
That's astounding. I'm afraid we've both seen that kind of filtering in reporting ever since that time. And as I look back, it's been really going on before that. Well, we have a number of callers. I think we'll start with Dave in Springfield. Dave, are you on the line?
Yes, good afternoon. My question is, in May, 329 congressmen and 76 senators signed on an AIPAC letter trashing Obama that he cannot speak without consulting Netanyahu first about Israel. In some other country, this will be treated as a treason and crime against this country. Why we Americans are sitting like fools and looking at our Congress, which is practically controlled by AIPAC?
Thank you very much. That's an important note. In addition to that action, I know the action to condemn the Goldstone report had over 200 co-signers, congressmen at the last minute wanting to co-sign an amendment that anybody who's read the Goldstone report is just appalled to see our Congress condemning. Senator Abourezk, would you like to discuss why more Americans are not doing something about this?
Well, because they don't hear about it primarily. I hadn't heard about this legislation he's talking about even. But if you're depending on the mainstream press to inform you on the Middle East, forget it.
This news came in Washington Post that 329 congressmen and 76 senators signed on AIPAC letter trashing Obama.
And then what they do with Obama? They praised him?
Oh, no, they were trashing him, that he is novice, he cannot speak about Israel without consulting Netanyahu first. A tiny country of 5 million people is governing America. And I have been writing in my blogs, America is an Israeli colony, and nobody pays attention to it.
Well, that's the problem, you see. I had not read that item. It's ridiculous and silly that they'd be able to tell the president what to do and what not to do in that regard.
I know that I, like you, feel that the reason more people are not speaking out on this issue is, as you said, most people don't have the full facts, and the media consistently don't give them to us. This is Alison Weir again with the CNI Jerusalem Calling program. With me today is former Senator James Abourezk from South Dakota, who was in Congress for many years and had first-hand experience with the power of the Israel lobby. And our first caller in this segment is Jeannie from West Nyack.
I am also from South Dakota. I now live in New York and have been horrified at the damage that the Israeli lobby has done to the United States and have wondered what to do. And the only conclusion that I can come to, because I know that any senator or any congressman who criticizes anything Israel does, such as stealing Palestinian land and water and imprisoning them, any senator or congressman will be vilified. Tons of money will be sent into his opponent to defeat him. I have come to the conclusion that the only way that we can stop the power of the Israeli lobby from damaging the United States to the point where we're almost at war with 1.5 billion Muslims is to have publicly financed campaigns. Can you think of... do you think this is
I totally
answer?
agree with that. In fact, my first year in the Senate, I went to the first Senate Democratic Caucus and introduced a resolution calling for complete public financing of all presidential and all congressional campaigns, just for that reason alone, and to avoid the corruption that comes along with private campaign financing. If you recall, I think it was in the 70s that the savings and loan scandal came about. It came about because the savings and loan industry had lobbied various congressional leaders to give them leeway to do whatever they wanted to do. And that cost, I guess the estimate, it cost the government $500 billion. The taxpayers had to pay $500 billion to bail out savings and loans and their depositors at that time. And I said, look, you wouldn't spend nearly that much money on public financing, and you'd at least have more honest elections. And the same is true with the Israeli lobby. If you could get away from private financing, which they use as a club, then you've gone a long way toward balancing out our foreign policy, especially in the Middle East.
We have Abdul from San Francisco who has a question.
My question is very similar to the other caller, and that is, that along with West Bank and Gaza, our Congress is also the occupied territory. I like the idea presented by the other caller, public financing. Other than that, I just would like to know why our Congress representatives are so afraid to speak the truth. They have no faith in the constituents that they will vote for them if they spoke the truth, which is good for the country, for Palestine, for Israel.
It deals with money. The Israeli lobby can gather contributions early on in people's campaign. When a new candidate wants to run for office, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, they go to see their campaign committees in Washington and say, where can I get some money? They always say, go see the Israeli lobby. Go to AIPAC. That's the first place they go, and they raise early money, but they get a commitment out of people they raise money for. The lobby will demand a written letter, some kind of a written statement, setting out what your position is on Israel. And if you don't say the right thing, you don't get any money raised. In fact, they'll raise money for your opponent. That's what faces people running for office. And the ones who are in office, when they want to get reelected, the same thing is true. They understand that there'll be money going to their opponent if they don't say and do the right thing.
And I think, in addition, they always find the loopholes, it appears to me, even with public financing. One wonders if there would be loopholes that they would discover. There are political action committees that are supposed to have a ceiling on the amount of money that can be raised on an issue, and yet we find the Israel lobby will create something, over 100 political action committees, often with names that disguise the purpose. For example, maybe called Northern Californians for Good Government.
Oh, yeah.
When in reality, it's raising money on behalf of Israel.
What you say is true. That's what happens. There are dozens and dozens of political action committees that do work for the Israeli lobby, for Israel itself. The way to get around that is just have public financing, period. And you may have to amend the Constitution to do it. because there's always the issue of free speech coming up if you try to prevent people from using campaign money in different ways. And that's a difficult task, I know, but I think it really has to be done.
Well, I think it is so essential because, as we know, and it sounds like these callers know, we see that our Congress consistently enacts policies that are just completely irrational and extremely self-destructive as well as destructive to the region.
They're not in the American interest, that's for sure.
Now we have another caller from Cincinnati. Bill?
I got interested in this right after 9/11 and read Congressman Finley's book, They Dare to Speak Out, and that actually led to a trip to Gaza. My eyes were truly opened up to what's going on, and I think anyone that does follow this, what you two are saying is very consistent with what I've heard and what they've heard. And it seems to me that if there can be a groundswell to get, like the BBC, the real BBC, not the BBC America, and Al Jazeera, stations like that, to be able to broadcast in the U.S., that would be such a huge step in the right direction because most Americans, as you two say, are simply ignorant of the facts.
Those would be helpful. Of course, interestingly, when you look at BBC, even though it is definitely so much better than the mainstream American media that most of us have access to, CNN, Fox News, CBS, ABC, it actually is also extremely Israeli-centric in its coverage. A book was written a few years ago by two professors from Glasgow University showing that BBC itself is also extremely flawed in its coverage of Israel-Palestine. I think that one of the things that we can all do, and this is Alison Weir speaking now, and from CNI and from If Americans Knew, all of us now have these alternative means. That's what we're using today with this radio station. So it's everybody that has begun to learn the facts on this issue begins telling their own communities about the facts. When we all use our email list to email people information about this radio program, about the CNI website, about the If Americans Knew website, if we create alternative radio programs in our communities, make use of the public access television stations, I think that that's one way to get around this as well. And it's in some ways an easier way. Creating an amendment to the Constitution, of course, is extremely difficult and I think is not going to happen quickly. But we now have these grassroots tools that we can all start using. I know I speak around the country. I know that the senator does. People in small towns and cities around the United States are starting to put on events about Israel-Palestine in their communities, at library speaker forums, on campuses, in Rotary clubs. I think all of us have to start doing this, and many people are starting, and that will be another way to try to bring this sort of change about. Senator Abourezk, how do you feel about a grassroots campaign and trying to enact something like that around the country?
I'm all for it, except I know how difficult that is. I tried to organize a grassroots organization amongst the Arab American community, and it was very difficult to do. They're divided. The Maronite Catholics refuse to participate, most because of their bishop told them not to. It's very difficult.
I know there's a great deal of effort to bring that kind of division in. I forgot to even mention that you had founded ADC, an important group in Washington, D.C., that's trying to organize more Arab Americans to speak out on behalf of American interests and their own community, and are doing that more and more often. Senator Abourezk, in 1983, AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, crafted a strategy which produced a $510 million increase in aid for Israel in 1983, despite the fact that the Reagan administration opposed such an increase, especially because this additional amount of U.S. money to Israel was being voted just after Israel's indiscriminate bombing of Beirut, in which thousands of people were killed. Cluster bombs were used that caused something like 1,000 amputation of limbs in one day. It was a brutal, ruthless bombing.
30,000 killed.
And this additional money that our Congress was voting to send to Israel came just after the slaughter in Sabra and Shatila refugee camps, and yet AIPAC managed to push that through. I noticed that in February of 1983, Secretary of State George Shultz named a panel to recommended changes in the foreign aid program. And on that panel, one lobbyist was named to be part of the discussion. That was AIPAC's Executive Director, Thomas Dine. So on a panel discussing how American aid would be disseminated, there was a lobbyist for AIPAC on the panel. You were the one person, I guess, who had actually opposed having him on the panel. And you said, quote, "It would make as much sense to let the president of Lockheed Corporation serve on a Defense Department board which decides what planes our Air Force will buy." And yet this is what went on in Washington, D.C. in 1983.
Recently I read something by Tom Dine, who apparently had an awakening on the Middle East. Apparently he's making moves towards Syria, trying to make friends with Syria. It's a private operation, not a public one. He talked in this writing the article I saw, or maybe it was part of his book, I don't know. He said that he used to sit and meet with George Shultz about every day when he was Secretary of State. So that makes sense that he would appoint him to a panel. It doesn't make much sense that he'd appoint an AIPAC representative to a panel, but...
Well, we have another caller with us, James from Los Angeles.
I think some key points that should be made as well. If you look at our support for Israel, which leveled buildings in Lebanon when Israel conducted brutal attacks there, you can look at the words of bin Laden, that those attacks actually provided inspiration for the tragic attacks on the World Trade Center in 1993 as well as on 9/11. And, people tend to overlook this. They try to say, they bring up other motivations for 9/11, but if you look at the 9/11, Commission report, it clearly conveys on page 147, as I conveyed to Lee Hamilton of the 9/11 Commission in Washington a few years ago. You can go to YouTube and look up what motivated the 9/11 hijackers to see my exchange with him. It was our support for Israel. The planner of 9/11, plotter, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, says it. And yet our media overlooks that. They keep on funneling billions of dollars to Israel. And in addition, a good friend of mine, Stephen Snagowski, has a book out titled The Transparent Cabal. And he makes a cogent argument that our support for Israel, the whole Palestinian issue, was the primary motivation for the attack on Iraq. It was to basically isolate the Palestinians, take down the regimes that support the Palestinians, Syria and Iran, and then have them give up hope and either have them transferred out of the West Bank and leave Gaza, and then Israel can reign supreme over that region.
I do think that Mr. Snagowski's book, The Transparent Cabal, is excellent investigative journalism. I think that anybody that wants to really understand the lead-up to the Iraq War and now the push for a similar kind of attack on Iran really does need to read that book, The Transparent Cabal. Senator Abourezk, do you have any comments about the lead-up to the Iraq War and why Israel seems to be very interested in destabilizing other countries in the region around Israel?
They have that interest, of course. Iraq was no threat to the United States. It was not a big threat to Israel because Saddam Hussein was very weak. All he had was a big mouth, and he's dangerous to his own people, not to anybody else. But Israel wanted him out of the way because he was a political obstacle, so we did his dirty work for him. He got all the neocons in Bush's administration got him to go to war there. And as far as the bin Laden thing, the Israeli lobby would like to deny that as much as they can. They don't want to have a widespread knowledge that their treatment of the Palestinians has a lot to do with animosity toward us, toward the American people, by people in the Middle East. Alison, if you would excuse me, I've got a meeting I have to attend, and I'd like to go now if you'd let me do that.
Well, certainly. It's been wonderful having you on here, and I hope that people will buy your book. It's called Advise and Dissent, and I don't know if it's still in print, but I know people can get it on Amazon and should read that. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yeah, well, I'll just say it's out of print, and I think Amazon sells used ones for about $1.70 a piece. They're pretty cheap. And also, there's a publisher putting it on electronic edition now, too. There's a publisher putting it on electronic edition now, too. There's a publisher putting